All right, well, thank everybody for coming. We really kind of thought tonight maybe there wouldn't be anybody here, so we're impressed. And this is our very first one, so hopefully there'll be more, and that'll be good for us. I'm Mary Kilmer from Delaware Opportunities Housing Office. My actual title is RPC Coordinator, but I'm the housing counselor in the office, so I help people that are interested in purchasing houses, people that their mortgage payment is overdue, and help with home repairs. This is my supervisor, Linda Hitt. She's the director of the housing office and over all the programs. We also offer, have Section 8 rental assistance in as part of our housing office, which is a good program if anybody wants more information on that. I put my information on the top of this in case you need to contact me. We do have applications and stuff here if anybody needs one. The first thing I kind of wanted to go over with the program is that it's a little different. I don't know if anybody knows, but we have an ongoing program in the village of Walton where first-time home buyers can purchase, and they have to agree to live in their house for 20 years. After the first 5 years, we do a calculation and there might be a repayment on it from year 6 to year 20. The new program is different in that it covers, there's a program for the village and there's a program for the town. So it's not just specifically to the village, which is kind of nice. And there is no repayment. You do have to live in your house for a 20-year period. We do file a second mortgage on it. And if you were to pay it off anytime in that 20-year period, you would pay it off prorated. If you live there 10 years, you would pay it off in 10 years. We do have a second mortgage on it, and we don't subordinate, which means that after you've lived in your house for a while, you build up what's called equity in your house, where you don't owe as much on your house, so you have equity that you can tap out into like a home equity loan or something like that. We don't subordinate to do that because we give you funds to help with down payment and repairs. We don't let you use that equity for anything other than to pay us back unless you live there for 20 years. Income guidelines are for one person in a household, it's $33,600. For two people, it's $38,400. For three people, it's $43,200. For four people, it's $48,000. 5 people, it's $51,850. And 6 people, it's $55,700. Which it's not a really low income, it's a moderate 80% of median income. We use either your gross income from your tax return or your gross pay stubs. And then the next thing that people need to do if they're interested is fill out an application, be income eligible, and then we do what's called housing counseling. And if you flip your agenda over, this is what I do for anybody that's interested in purchasing a house. We have home ownership classes. And I also do a lot one-on-one because it doesn't always work out to do a class. We talk about the advantages and the drawbacks of home ownership. Like an advantage is that lots of times you can take the interest off on your taxes. You own a home of your own. You can put nails in the wall if you want to. A drawback is that if you get in over your head, which we're going to make sure that you don't. But if you get laid off or something happens, then we have to work through that. But we try not to get people in over their head. Sometimes, you know, life happens and that does happen. Can you afford to buy a house? One of the things in counseling that we do is go over how long you've worked, how long you've had your job, what your source of income is. Then we talk about finding the right house. I have people start with a piece of paper and draw exactly what they would like in a house. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, whatever it is that you want. And then you start looking at houses. And you try to find your dream house. But as you look at houses, you realize maybe it's not in your price range. Maybe it's not exactly what you wanted. And you decide what I can settle for. You have 4 girls growing up, and you want 2 bathrooms, and you can't find anything that doesn't have more than 1 bathroom in it. You might want to keep looking. Girls need their own bathrooms. That's very important. So you have to decide what's important and what's not. And then the next thing we talk about is a home inspection, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes, so I'm going to go back to that. Shopping and applying for a loan. We talk about preparing for closing, what you do on closing day. Understanding what your obligations are as a borrower. Basically pay your utilities, maintain your home, which is the next one. Maintaining your home, what you should do every spring, what you should do every fall to your house to winterize it and get it ready for summer. Maintaining your home, just all the things that you need to do, rake the leaves and that kind of thing. Financial planning, we talk about setting up a budget so that after you're closed you know how much your mortgage payment is every month and you can make it on time every month. So that's what we do in home buyer class, and like I said, we do them one-on-one or we do them in a group. So that's the next step as far as counseling, or as far as the village or the town of Walton application goes. The next thing I suggest you do is get pre-approved. We have 4 lending institutions that we can use. We can either use the National Bank of Delaware County, which is the Walton Bank, Sydney Federal Credit Union, the Community Bank, or we can use USDA Rural Development. Those are what the village and the town consider as local. You can't get your mortgage from Quicken Loans or any of the predatory over the internet kind of thing. It has to be a local financial institution. Your loan has to close in Walton, which is to keep business in the community, which is what, when you start purchasing a house, you're doing, becoming part of the community. The next thing is that the money that we have available in the village and the town, it's a little different. Part of it can go towards down payment. You do have to have 3% of the purchase price available up front before we start. If you're anticipating a tax return, which at this time of year a lot of people are, we can say that you're going to get a tax return back, and then when it goes into the bank, you can provide me a copy of your bank statement so that we can verify you have at least 3% of the purchase price. The rest of it we can help with down payment, we can help with closing costs. And then with this grant, it's a little new, we have a repair element. So our rehab specialist will come out and go completely through the house and see if there's anything that needs to be done as far as repairs go. We have to add all of those things up, and that's how much your second mortgage would be, or the grant would be. We hope to have an average of about $25,000. Actually, the hope is a little less than $25,000, but you know, it is hard. I always encourage people to find properties, find homes that really don't need a lot of repair money, because you can easily get into roofs of $10,000, and you know, that takes away from the 25 as far as what you have left for down payment and closing costs. So you need to find a house that's in good shape. And are there any questions about the grant program or how it works? Anything that anybody wants to ask?
Can you purchase not a mobile home but manufactured?
As long as one of those financial institutions will allow it. We can kind of talk about that later, if that's all right. We try to do existing housing, but we can talk about that a little later. And that's about all I have to say about the program. Steve Dutcher is going to talk, he's the town and the village code enforcement officer, and he's going to talk about the fact that we also have to have flood insurance on our house if it's in a flood zone. So he's going to talk about the do's and don'ts of that area.
All right. Thank you. As was stated, I am the code enforcement official for the town and the village. I'm also a certified floodplain manager. And several months ago, I think it was, these two fine ladies came to me and said, we have a home repair component and what about flood? So we did some education up at their office, talking about all of the things to consider in terms of what they have to manage in dealing with flood issues. And we decided to put a short program together to try to educate folks, first-time home buyers, on the kind of thing to look out for when you're shopping for a home, and specifically related to flood, because 30% of our village is in a floodplain. That's a lot. So when you get out there and get house shopping, chances are you're going to look at one or two places that have some sort of flood ramifications. They're in floodplain, they're close to a floodplain, whatever the case may be. So that being said, we'll dive right in. When you're out looking for a home, you're probably considering at least some of these issues. What's the neighborhood like? Is the school nearby? How about hospital, police station, fire hall? How big of a house do I need? Do I want something that's newer or something to work on? All of these kinds of things go into you looking for a home and trying to decide what it is that you want to get. The question is, have you given any consideration to flooding? I know that when I was house shopping 20-some years ago, thought never crossed my mind. And thankfully I bought in a place that doesn't flood, but not everybody's as lucky. And then one day they wake up and find out that they are in a floodplain. So give some consideration to flooding. Do you know the flood risk for the property that you want to purchase? How do you know what the risks are? Once you do know, what are your options for mitigating that risk if you absolutely have to have that house? We're going to talk about that. First thing that you can do in determining what the flood risk is check the flood maps. You can check with me, both at the town and the village. Probably I'm going to be your best source to come find out, if a house, a property is sitting in a floodplain. But you can also look elsewhere. We have all of the flood maps are at the library. You can go to the FEMA website and look at them online at the FEMA website as well. That's basically what you're going to find, and I have the actual real map back here if somebody wants to look at it afterwards, just so you know what you can
So
see
all
one
of
in
the
real
blue
life.
is the floodplains?
All of the blue is a floodplain. It's kind of hard to see on here. You'll see a little bit of black right here. That's going to be your 500-year floodplain. It's mapped on there, but it's not regulatory. Okay? So basically everything between the blue lines is your floodplain. And if you can see here, these hashed lines, that's the floodway. That's where your water is going to be the highest and fastest in a flood event. So you get moving through the process of buying a house, and before you sign the contract, there is a disclosure requirement. The seller has to disclose all kinds of issues regarding the house, one of them being flood. And question 10 on there is any or all of the property located in a designated floodplain? By law, they're supposed to report that if it is. And are there any flooding, drainage, or grading problems that resulted in standing water on any portion of the property? These are yes or no questions. They're either going to say yes or they're going to say no, and they're not going to give any detail. So if you get a yes answer to any of those, then you need to start asking questions. What was the nature of the flooding? You know, was it runoff from the street was coming through the basement, or was it the stream out back that came up and came through the basement? Understand what, you know, what caused them to answer that question as yes. So, as I stated, how many times has it flooded? What's the source? How much damage occurred? Was the damage repaired when it flooded? Has anything been done to mitigate the source of the flooding by the homeowner or the municipality? If it's in a floodplain, how much will the flood insurance be? Major question to ask. Okay? Just because it's in a floodplain doesn't necessarily mean that the current owner has flood insurance. But if they do, see if you can find out what it is that they're paying on an annual basis. If it's close but not in, the lender, the person that's giving you the money to buy this house, may still require you to carry flood insurance just because it's close. They have a right to protect their investment, and they know that 25% of flood insurance claims are for properties that are actually outside of that flood hazard area, that blue spot that you saw on the map.
Steve,
Ma'am?
could you just go back and explain what it means to mitigate?
Where did I have it in there?
Next
Right, the
slide.
screen you were just on.
Screen I was just on.
Yep, just the second bullet there.
Okay, has anything been done to mitigate the source? Mitigate means to take action to make it go away, basically. Okay, so, you know, have they, if it's just a drainage issue, have they done something to repair the drainage so that it doesn't come into the house? That sort of thing.
Or in some cases in the village where the stream beds have been lined and taken care of.
Right, that would be-
The municipality is actually
Yep,
taking care of.
municipality's actually done something to try to lessen the impacts of flood.
So like on Griswold Street where they put all of the rock
Right.
wall in.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Down by the country store where they, a couple of years ago,
Yeah.
they reclaimed that floodplain down there. That would be an example of mitigation. The
Yeah.
green space, the reporter property down there where we took out the building and graded that so that the water will flow back to the river instead of sit in our fishbowl that is Delaware Street down there. Those are all mitigation projects. All right, so I think I covered everything there, okay? Let me back up this. That bottom bullet, is there an elevation certificate for the property? Elevation certificates are becoming very, very, very important when it comes to flood insurance. Where the first floor of that house is in relation to what the 100-year flood level is just about the sole deciding factor in how expensive that flood insurance is going to be. Those blue lines on here, all of this blue represents a 100-year floodplain. In other words, that's the 1% annual chance that the water is going to get that high during a flood, okay? And I can, if you come and see me and you're interested in property, I can tell you probably within a few tenths of an inch how high that water is going to be.
Steve, can you just put into perspective on that map where things are located? Like where's Main Street on that map?
Oh, let's see here. This is going to be Main Street right
Okay.
here. And this is Route 10 heading downriver, 206 heading
Okay.
up. So that elevation certificate becomes very critical. Depending on the current owner and what their flood insurance status is, they may have been required already to get an elevation certificate. So if they have it, ask about it, get a copy of it.
And remind me again how you get an elevation certificate?
Elevation certificate can be done by an engineer, certified engineer,
Okay.
or surveyor. Because those are the only two individuals in New York State that can provide you with an elevation certificate.
And how much does that cost?
Depends on where you are. It can be $500 up to $1,500 or $2,000. It depends on where the property is and how close benchmarks are. A big adder, multiplier to the price is how far they got to pull their elevations from. Right here at the library, there's a benchmark on the side of the library. So, you know, chances are pretty good, you know, Townsend Street over to Griswold Street, kind of that circle in this area, probably not going to be too expensive. You start getting out past there, if they can't pull from other benchmarks, you're pulling further, so chances are it's going to be a little bit more.
But those expenses are eligible to be part of the grant that we have. Those could be paid for with some of that rolled into the cost of it.
And there's also nothing wrong with asking the seller to provide you one as part of the contract. You know, it's kind of you hold them hostage a little bit and say, okay, I'll buy the house, but you got to give me an elevation certificate. And if they get that written into the contract, then, you know, that's one less thing that you got to worry about. And this is the first page of an elevation certificate. So this is the type of document that you'd be getting. And it's going to have all of the information on there that you're going to need. It's going to tell you, up in here, it's going to give you some elevations for the various components of the building. It's going to give you the base flood elevation. Again, it's good information to have, and if you got to buy flood insurance, you're going to need that elevation certificate. But it's not going to do you a whole lot of good unless you can compare apples to apples. So you also need to, if you can work it in, have them provide an actual benchmark on the structure someplace so that you know what you're measuring to, or have somebody. You can actually contact the surveyor or engineer that did it, because their information is on there, and make sure that you're clear in terms of where you're measuring to.
So you only need an elevation certificate if you need flood insurance on a house?
That's
Or
correct.
should you get one with every house that you purchase?
No, you don't need one with every house. It pertains to structures that would be in the floodplain or possibly just, you know, on the edge of the floodplain. There's plenty of instances where we've had people that their house is actually, you know, 40 feet above the stream bed, but their property goes all the way down to the stream bed, and their lender has called them up and said, if you don't buy flood insurance, we're going to force place it.
Right.
So then they've had to go get an elevation certificate to prove that they're actually 40 feet above.
Okay.
My house across the road is a perfect example of that. Because the corner of the property was down on the floodplain, down the field behind, we were paying real high flood insurance. But
Gotcha.
after the certificate of elevation, it showed that the house was actually 6 inches above the AZ or the next level. So a big, big savings on our flood insurance.
And it's something that's critical here, and a lot of our houses are turn-of-the-century structures that have foundations. And if you've got 4 walls surrounded by dirt, your basement floor is your lowest elevation. Okay? There's some ways to work around that, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So that's the kind of document that you're looking for, though, that elevation certificate. If you come up with one, please check with my office and make sure that I have a copy of it. It becomes tremendously helpful if I have building a database of that information, so that if the house next door wants to do something, I got something to refer to. I know what elevations are. It becomes very helpful. And as part of community rating system, which I'll talk about briefly in a minute, I also am required to maintain those elevation certificates so that we can get points. All right, so After educating yourself about all of the flood risks, you just absolutely have to have that house that's in the floodplain. Okay? Now what? There's some things that you can do to better protect your home, and this might fall into that category of the repair component as part of this program. Some simple things that you can do. You can elevate the utilities. Remember I said most of these houses have basements. Most of the basements are full of utilities. You get your furnace down there, your water heater, things of that sort. So just simply by moving them to the first floor, you're better protecting your home. May or may not have any effect on your flood insurance, but the next time you get high water, you're not replacing a furnace or rebuilding it. You can anchor and or elevate fuel and propane tanks. Fuel and propane tanks aren't quite as common in the village because we have gas, so a lot of people are plumbed into the NYSEG gas, but there are still a few around, me being one of them. I have a fuel oil tank in my basement. If you anchor it and otherwise, do a few other things to waterproof it, the next time you get high water, your oil tank doesn't become a bobber in your basement, flip upside down and contaminate your basement with fuel oil. When making any repairs, you need to use flood damage resistant materials in the areas below that base flood elevation. Remember I talked about how important it is to have that elevation certificate. If you got that elevation certificate, you're going to be able to figure out what the base flood elevation is. If you know that, in comparison to your house, then you know where you got to use flood resistant materials and where you don't. We're talking about, if you're going to use wood, use pressure treated wood or black locust or cedar. All three of those are decay resistant materials, or you can use concrete. If you've got to insulate, you can use closed cell foam insulation instead of fiberglass bats. All of those types of items are resistant to flood damage, and chances are pretty good you're not going to have to replace them if you do get flooded. You're just going to have to open up walls, let things dry out, put it back together, and you're on your way, instead of rebuilding half of your house. New York State Code requires, this isn't just the flood law, New York State Code also requires the use of flood damage resistant materials, and they actually refer to the FEMA technical bulletin number 2, which gives you all of the information that you need about flood damage resistant materials. Just an example of an elevated furnace. That furnace used to sit flat on the floor, now it's about 3 feet higher. Didn't quite, looking at the elevation certificate, I know we didn't quite get it out of the floodplain, but if you've got a foot or two of water in there, which is probably going to be more common, you're not going to have to replace the furnace the next time you get flooded. A few other examples. As you can see on the top up there, these are some of the utilities that they put up on top. This is actually the inside, where they needed to mount some things inside in the attic. So they've elevated their heat and AC and their water heater is all put in the attic, with the exterior components of those put up on the roof. Some things that didn't get moved that could still cause them to have to pay a little bit more flood insurance. You got your walk-in refrigerator exterior motor. They consider that a building utility, and if you've got one in that flood zone, they're probably going to get an extra few dollars from you. The last option is the most expensive option, but it's a possibility to elevate the structure. The cost is going to be somewhat relative to how high you need to elevate, but it's ultimately the best protection. If you elevate that structure so that first floor, that first living floor is above the base flood elevation, and your basement is no longer a basement, it's filled in with dirt, that's going to drastically reduce your flood insurance. As noted down here, if your first floor elevation is below the base flood elevation, you could be looking at something like $4,000 a year for flood insurance. If you've got it 2 feet above the base flood elevation, you might be looking at $800 a year for flood insurance or less. So, again, understand that that's the most expensive option, but it certainly is the best protection in the long run. And here's an example of somebody elevated their house. Looks to me like, I don't know, maybe 4 feet. They elevated and put it on concrete pilings. I'm sure this isn't the finished photo because you can enclose that. If you enclose this underneath here, it has to be with breakaway walls so that if the flood water pushes against it, just pushes it out of the way instead of pushing on the whole structure and pushing the structure over. You can also put in flood vents, so you could have a more solid wall, but put in flood vents so that the water flows through that space instead of pushing against it. You've been in your house 10 years. Life is good. And then you come to me one day and say, well, gee, I want to fix my house up. Or, gee, I just got damaged by a flood. What happens? Well, there's a couple of things, a couple of definitions that we need to understand. They're similar but different, if that makes sense. Substantial damage and substantial improvement. In our flood law, we have what's called a substantial damage, and that is if your house gets damaged by any source. It could be flooding, fire, hurricane, whatever. If it gets damaged and the cost to repair that damage is 50% of the value of the structure or more, you have to bring that house into compliance with the current flood laws, which means for a residential structure, you have to elevate it now. You don't have a choice. Substantial improvement is very much the same thing. You haven't sustained any damage, but you decide, I'm going to do some home improvements. I'm going to completely remodel my kitchen, and I'm going to, turn that old den into my man cave, woman cave, whatever it is that you want to do to it. If the cost of those improvements exceeds 50% of the value of the structure, then you have to bring the structure into compliance with flood law.
How long do you have to do that?
How long do you have?
Yeah.
Well, in terms of with substantial damage,
So like if the house got flooded and
Right.
you had to fix it up because of the damage,
Mhm.
how long do you have to bring it into compliance?
well, that's having never lived through that, because I wasn't code in the last flood. I'll put it to you this way. Your house is damaged. If it's substantially damaged, that means that you can't live in it.
Right.
Okay? If you can't live in it, probably my focus is going to be elsewhere until the dust settles a little bit from all of that damage, and then we'll start focusing on houses that are still sitting there vacant. Okay? And another part of code would kick in. You now have an unsafe structure. If I were to determine it to be, or start the enforcement activity on that as an unsafe structure, would start with, you got 30 days to comply, which would mean that you got 30 days to come in and talk to me, let's figure something out. At the end of that 30 days, if nothing had happened, depending on the circumstances, I might give you another 30 days to make something happen with the structure, or it might be 90 days. It's kind of my judgment as far as that goes, beyond that. And, if we're looking at 60 damaged structures in the village and everybody's trying to recover, probably not going to, come bonk you over the head because you haven't done anything immediately. It takes a while to, access FEMA and do all of those sorts of things, but ultimately something would have to happen with that property. And I just wanted to clarify, I've tried to stress it a couple of times, it's the value of the structure. So if you bought your house, obviously it's sitting on a piece of land. The house might be worth $60,000, the land might be worth $20,000. Well, that 50% cost is going to be based on that 60, not 60 and 20 added together and 80. Okay, so you're looking at your 50% threshold is at 30,000, not 40,000. Okay, just wanted to clarify that. So that's basically it for substantial damage and substantial improvement. I could go on forever about it because there's a lot of nuances to it. When you start talking about putting additions on a house in a floodplain, depends on how you're attaching that addition in terms of whether or not you have to bring the whole house into compliance or just the addition into compliance. So it gets kind of complex. So again, if you have to do substantial damage or you have to comply due to substantial damage or substantial improvement, that means for a residential structure, it has to be elevated to 2 feet above the base flood elevation. In New York State, as part of our building code and as part of our local flood law, there's what's called 2 feet of freeboard. That's built in as the safety factor. So if the base flood is here and we only build to here, what if our calculations were off under base flood and the actual 100-year flood is here? Well, you still got water in your basement or on your first floor. So to counteract that, we built in a 2-foot freeboard. So you got your base flood elevation here, you actually have to build to here in order to be considered out of the, and the flood insurance looks at it the same way as well. When flood insurance rates a house, they're looking to see how high above base flood elevation that first floor is. And if it's 2 feet or less above base flood elevation, they're rating you as if you're at base flood elevation, which means more money. Increased cost of compliance. That's extra insurance. You don't have to do anything really to purchase it. You don't have to, have a rider on your flood insurance policy. That's insurance that is available along with your regular flood insurance to help offset the cost of elevating your home or removing your home. They'll add up to an additional $30,000 to an insurance claim for a maximum of $250,000. That's the maximum they will pay out. With your regular flood insurance and your ICC combined, that's the maximum that they will pay out to help pay for elevation or removal of your home. That law also states that if you choose to make improvements to your home, if they exceed 50% of the value of the structure, you must bring the entire structure into compliance with the flood damage prevention law. I went over that before. So, one way or another, their goal is to either, quite honestly, to either get that home out of the floodplain one way or the other, whether you take it up in the air so the water flows underneath it, or you remove it completely. That's kind of their goal. I would like to see them stay here, just elevated. All right, you can go to villageofwalton.com or townofwalton.org, either website. Our websites are similar in the content that they have. A lot of the stuff that I've talked about tonight is on there in terms of the flood law, floodplain development permits, elevation certificate information, things of that sort.
You said it's townofwalton.org, right?
Yes. Okay. Resources. Other resources. I actually have a handout right here that has these resources listed. Just again, the technical bulletin that I referred to and a lot of other technical bulletins are available at the FEMA.gov website. flood maps. You can find them here at the village office, at the town office, at the library, at FEMA.gov. Flood insurance information, floodsmart.gov. That's not all they have. They have a lot of good information on there. But they also have, that's floodsmart.gov, they have a flood insurance estimator. You might have to come pick my brain a little bit to get some technical information about the property that you're looking at. But you can go plug that information in to their estimator, and it'll give you a ballpark as to what your flood insurance is going to cost. So you can use that in determining whether or not you can afford to buy this house. And then any other local flood information you can check at the village or town website, or come talk to me. I'd be happy to talk to you. Any questions? I threw a lot of information at you.
With the grant, are we still eligible for that if we are looking at a house in a flood zone?
Yes.
As long as you meet these, yeah,
Okay.
you'd have to
Yeah,
have
okay.
flood insurance. Mhm.
So
In a
basically,
flood zone, but not a floodway.
right,
Okay.
That's what we
But
talked
there-
about before, right?
right.
Yeah.
But there aren't a lot of floodways.
There's enough, there's probably not a lot of houses in floodway. Most of our floodway is, well, you're gonna find some along Eastbrook, some houses that might be in the floodway, but most of our floodway is right downtown.
I would say that out of that, the most important thing was that make sure you have an elevation certificate. If in doubt, make sure you have one. And if the seller really wants to sell it, there's money available right now to help with that. Houses are, starting to move a little bit, but if they've been on the market for a while, there's nothing wrong with asking for an elevation certificate. Make it part of your deal as far as your contract of sale. Don't sign a purchase agreement without
Yeah.
knowing whether there is one or not, and just make sure that they can pay for it.
I was, that section where I was talking about the real estate law that requires disclosure, and if you got a yes answer in there, start asking questions. I had a guy come to me today, was looking at a property, wanted to know if it was in the floodplain. We got talking about it, we looked on the flood maps. The property itself is not in the floodplain, but I know the area, and I said, you might want to go back and talk to the guy that's selling this piece of property and find out during these rain events that we've had, whether it's been the actual floods or just heavy rains or whatever, find out if water's running through that building, because given its location, he could be getting runoff right from the main road onto his property and through his building. And you're the one making the commitment to however much money this house costs. So you want to be the one that's confident that you're getting what you want and you're not going to get in over your head. If you go buy a house and then turn around and find out you've got a $2,500 a year flood insurance bill that you didn't think about, after you signed the contract, it's kind of too late. So, and it's true whether we're talking about floods or any other risks that might be associated with home ownership. If you got a question about it, ask.
And that's why in class, it's always important to figure out how much you can afford, how much your principal's going to be, interest, your escrow, whether it's homeowner's insurance or flood insurance, and how much your taxes are, because that's all part of payment. Your payment isn't just principal and interest, so we work on that together.
Any other questions?
Yeah, Mary, I got a question for you. What if there's a party of 3 that want to go in on a deal to buy a house? How would that work?
If there were going to be 3 people in the household, it would be based on 3 people's income.
Okay.
And the income eligibility for 3 people is $43,200, so it would have to be less than that a year. And all 3 people would have to be part of it, assuming they're adults, all 3
Yeah,
people would
they're
have
all
to be part of the counseling classes and on the application and on the mortgage.
Anybody else? All right, well, I thank you for coming,
Thank you.
and if you come up with any other questions after you wander out of here, by all means, you're going to find me either at this office or at the town office, so I'll be happy to answer your questions. I want to thank Jessica Patterson from Soil and Water for assisting me with putting this together. She's a PowerPoint guru, so I just wanted to shout out to Jessica and Soil and Water for helping put this together.
All right, thank you very much for coming. My information is on the top. If you have any questions, just.
And you brought applications here if anybody wants to take one, right?
Yep, yep.
All right,
All right, thank you.
thank you.
Thank you.